Back we are again at part 2 of the Purphoros deck, tlatotem in command. Sorry about that. I had quite a bit of this recorded, but I had to cut it off to make it fit, or rather I ran out of storage space. And to make it into 2 videos, I had to split it off differently. Anyway, we've already talked about how our card draw works, or rather how our types of card draw works. So now let's get on to our utility cards. There's actually quite a few different things to do. Life gain is a very important part of any kind of commander match. Obviously, commander damage gets around life gain. That's why they came up with commander damage to begin with. But life gain in and of itself is just a decent strategy because a lot of people will play commander just for its colors, or they'll play the commander just to get extra effects out of it. They don't necessarily deal any damage with their commander. Purphoros is different because Purphoros could outright kill an entire group of opponents just with his ability. In this case, though, if he's not a creature, you'd want to put one of these lifelink abilities on something else. But since we're talking about damage dealing and different effects, I thought it'd be interesting to point out that, cards like Batterskull actually produces a token. Luxodon Warhammer gives your creatures trample and lifelink, and Basilisk Collar gives your creature death touch and lifelink, and that works very well with other creatures that deal damage. In this case, what we've already seen, not too awful many sources for that kind of damage, but you still get a decent effect out of all of these 3 cards. You can use Basilisk Collar on some cards that are actually coming up that I'll be talking about in just a minute. But for now, it works extremely well with Jaya Ballard, Task Mage. See, Jaya was the original, I guess you could call her the Planeswalker creature. She was before they could have Planeswalker cards, but she does 3 effects. She does, 3 mana, 2 red and 1 for a 2/2 creature, legendary human spell shaper. Her first ability is 1 red, tap, discard a card, destroy target blue permanent. And that doesn't seem like much of an ability, but spell shapers, they were really good because it was a repeatable ability, and we'll come back to that first one. The second ability, 1/1 red, tap, discard a card, deals 3 damage to target creature or player, and the creature can't be regenerated. That's Incinerate from Ice Age block. And, for example, the first ability is actually Pyroblast from Ice Age, and the second ability is Incinerate from Ice Age, and those are really great abilities. The third ability, though, is 7 mana, 2 red mana, and 5, discard a card, and Jaya Ballard deals 6 damage to each creature and each player. Now, where these effects are really great with lifelink should be self-explanatory. If you put Basilisk Collar on Jaya Ballard and use the second ability to deal 3 damage to target creature or player, it's going to be 3 damage, you gain 3 life from it. But if it's a creature, that death touch is automatically going to destroy that creature. On the other hand, if you just have Batterskull or Luxodon Warhammer on Jaya Ballard, that's still going to be 3 life. I mean, that's 3 damage that you're going to be able to deal. The other cool thing about it is, if you use her third ability, dealing 6 damage to each creature and each player, that includes her and your opponent and yourself. But if she has lifelink, then you're going to be gaining at minimum 12 life, just between you and one opponent. With other opponents, you're actually going to net a life gain from that ability, which is pretty great. Now, her first ability allows her to destroy a target blue permanent. We talked a little bit about these 2 cards. Scuttlemutt and Distorting Lens work very well with Jaya Ballard. Scuttlemutt allows her to... Scuttlemutt can turn one of your opponent's creatures into a blue creature, which allows Jaya Ballard to then destroy her by destroy the creature, because it's now a blue permanent. On the other hand, if your opponent's creature has protection from red, and its toughness is low enough, you can turn Jaya Ballard into a blue creature, or a green creature, or a black creature. What doesn't matter, because she's no longer red, protection no longer means anything against her. Likewise, Distorting Lens works very well with Jaya Ballard because you can turn a person's lands into blue permanents, or anything. You can turn their creatures, their artifacts, their enchantments into blue permanents, and then Jaya Ballard can destroy it by paying 1 red and discarding a card. If you can get this combo out early, that's game. You become the biggest threat, and at this point, if your opponent hasn't realized that you could do this, then you're going to win. These 2 cards work very well with Jaya Ballard. They work very well in general, just getting around protection from. Distorting Lens, as I said before, it works very well with swords. The neat thing is, if somebody has a sword on one of their own creatures, you use Distorting Lens to turn the sword into the color that it's protecting from, and it falls off of that creature. Because the creature has protection from that color, it can't be equipped or enchanted by anything of that color, and it has to fall off. That's, fun. Now, we also talked about, well, the strategy of Purphoros with being able to put a creature into play suddenly works extremely well with Dash, just as a type of permanent. And the same thing happened with Flame Rush Rider. Did I not do that one yet? Let me see. Yeah, Flame Rush Rider and Mardu Scout, you can dash both of them in for 6 mana. By themselves, it's not quite enough to turn Purphoros into a creature. You need 1 more red mana to do it, because Flame Rush Rider's dash cost doesn't count as its converted mana cost. But these are great because Mardu Scout, you can dash it in for 1/1 red, and it's going to deal 2 damage from it coming into play. It's going to swing out for 3 and possibly turn Purphoros into a creature with that extra red devotion. It's just a nice utility creature. It doesn't really fit with most strategies, but it works very well in this situation. And speaking of life gain, well, we were talking about life gain a few minutes ago. Punishing Fire is just a nice utility card, especially in multiplayer. You can actually work with your opponents and say, hey, if you'll gain life, I'll cast this, deal 2 damage to that. Then I'll pull it back when you gain life, and I'll cast and deal 2 more damage to that card. Again, so for 5 mana, you can deal 4 damage to something, just as long as you have a partner in the know. Whoops. That's a different deck that I'm working on for later. But having a partner help you out that way, it's unexpected, but it really works in multiplayer. Meanwhile, Gorilla Shaman helps get rid of artifacts and artifact lands. It was called the Mox Monkey because of its ability. It's 1 red mana for a 1/1 creature, but X, X, and 1 destroy target non-creature artifact with casting cost equal to X. This gets rid of Mox Opal, Mox Diamond, and any other type of Mox because the casting cost is 0. So 0 plus 0 plus 1 is 1. So it only costs 1 mana to destroy a Mox. It also only costs 1 mana to destroy a Great Furnace or Ancient Den or Tree of Tales because those are artifacts and you can get rid of them. This card would be extremely useful with a Liquid Metal Coating, but unfortunately Liquid Metal Coating doesn't work in this type of a deck. Not quite. I'm working on another mono-red commander deck that will use it, and we'll come back to that. But we're still talking about our utility cards that don't necessarily fit the theme. The last one is Gamble, the red tutor from Urza's Saga. Gamble is kind of a funny type of a red tutor, though. It's 1 red mana, you search your library for a card, put the card into your hand, then you discard a card at random. You shuffle your library afterward, but having to discard a card at random changes how effective it is, but on your first turn, you might play a mountain and tap it and cast this and search for your Soul Ring or Mana Vault to get that burst of mana on your next turn. And that makes things different. I would go for a Mana Vault so you can get out Purphoros on turn 2, because if Purphoros gets out on turn 2, it's very unlikely that somebody's going to have an answer for him. So Gamble works very well in a mono-red deck, or any type of deck, especially if you were playing a deck where your graveyard matters. Gamble's an excellent tutor card. Now, let's talk about our removal cards. Things that, this is really a land destruction strategy that we have right here. I mentioned these before in Weenie Envy. Dwarven Blast Miner and Dwarven Miner, they're essentially the same card, except one's a little bit lower. It only has 1 toughness instead of 2, but you can morph it into play as a 2/2 colorless creature. And that's about where as far as the differences go. They both are 2 mana to get out, 1/1 red, and they both have 2/1 red tap, destroy target non-basic land. And in Commander, non-basic lands are abundant. But obviously land destruction is kind of a mean thing to do. You do not make many friends playing land destruction. You don't have to make friends playing land destruction, though. But this deck plays them because utility lands are very annoying. Things like Maze of Ith and just in general, those type of effects. And I very rarely end up having to use them to destroy lands just to be mean. I will say, though, that, okay, you're killing my creatures, fine, I'm destroying 2 of your lands, or I'm destroying that land there because you killed my creature. It's possible to get these out early and maintain a little bit of a, what should I call that, a squeeze. You keep your opponent from wanting to do too awful much against you with their lands. And if they play utility lands that are definitely going to be too powerful, there's nothing more satisfying than destroying a Gia's Cradle on your 3rd turn because they couldn't do anything with it. Or, that's a $300 card or at least a $150 card, and these are like $2. And there's 2 of them. You can only play 1 Gia's Cradle. I think every commander deck and every deck in general should have a little bit of land destruction, because this type of effect can mean the difference between win and loss without having to just destroy all your opponent's lands outright. Just being able to take care of a threat like a Maze of Ith or too much mana from Nykthos Shrine to Nyx is necessary. Along the same lines, Chaos Warp can get rid of a land at the possibility of putting out a Blightsteel Colossus. It also has the effect, though, that you can get rid of Blightsteel Colossus at the cost of putting out a land. It's an interesting card. It can get rid of enchantments that normally red wouldn't be able to take care of, and of course, on the off chance that you accidentally put an instant or sorcery on top of their library, nothing happens. It's the kind of card that should not exist. Mark Rosewater has talked at length about how these type of cards break the color pie, and I understand how it breaks the color pie, but I also understand that it's a decent card. I mean, it's a really good card, and you ought to be playing it, honestly. I believe this was reprinted recently, but it probably still has a lot to its price. On the other hand, we have cards like Ember Swallower, which, even if you don't get much of a land destruction theme going, just having an Ember Swallower is a good idea. It forces players to sacrifice 3 lands when you go monstrous with it. In some cases, you might actually be able to cast it and on the same turn use its monstrous ability. It can be done at instant speed, and it's just a good strategy in general. A lot of times players will pull out a bunch of extra lands and somebody gets too much of an advantage. You need to be able to reel that back just a little bit, especially with decks that play 4 and 5 color, most likely 5 color decks. Just 3 lands. 3 lands is enough to disrupt a strategy and potentially keep a Sliver Hive Lord from coming into play. That's why it's kind of in the deck. And of course, 7/8 is pretty good in and of itself. Then we have cards like Lava Ball Trap and Fissure, both instant speed land destruction and or extra effects. Lava Ball Trap actually can deal 4 damage to each creature in play, including flying creatures, which is unusual for red to be able to do that. Fissure, on the other hand, is 5 mana cost, bury target land or creature. That's the original wording on it. Bury replaced destroyed, not be able to regenerate. But that's... well, actually, bury was replaced by destroy and not be able to regenerate, so you can get rid of a land or creature at instant speed. Very nice. Lava Ball Trap normally costs 8 mana, but if an opponent had 2 or more lands enter the battlefield under their control, you can pay 5 mana instead. And being able to destroy 2 lands is extremely powerful, especially if they did something like Evolving Wilds or any of the fetch lands. They didn't actually gain 2 lands, they just played 1 land that they really wanted, and then you destroyed 2 lands for 5 mana, and it's a good strategy in general. Being able to instant speed destroy lands, 8 mana, even at the end of somebody's turn, might be enough to change the tide to your favor. And that's our minimal land destruction strategy in this deck, although, as I can point out, they're not just land destruction. I mean, these are a decent land threat. That's not the right word. They make people think twice before killing them, is what I'm trying to say. It's like, oh, somebody's going to board wipe? Well, I'm getting rid of your lands in response. Good. And now we talk about the board wipes. These aren't true board wipes, but they're very useful ones. In fact, this is one that isn't really a board wipe at all, but I can't really call it a utility creature. Molten Hydra. Red used to have really, really good Hydra cards. It's a 1/1 red for a 1/1 creature. For every 3 mana you spend 1 and 2 red mana, you put a +1/+1 counter on Molten Hydra, which is a great pump ability. It keeps the creature getting bigger and bigger. But then tap, remove all +1/+1 counters from Molten Hydra, and it deals 1 damage to target creature player for each 1/1 counter removed. That's a very nice way. I mean, like we said earlier, we can give it lifelink and or death touch, perhaps with Basilisk Collar, but giving it lifelink and then being able to hit for that Batterskull, for example, putting that on the Molten Hydra, and then swinging out with it, and then after combat damage is dealt, having it tap to deal damage to something for extra life gain is terrific. And +1/+1 counters are underrated in red. You don't normally get to see that kind of an effect. But here's another one that does it. Ashling the Pilgrim, 1/1 red for a 1/1 creature, but for every 1/1 red you spend, you put a +1/+1 counter on her. However, if you use that ability 3 times, that is, pay 3 red and 3 colorless, 6 mana, activate all on the same turn, you remove all +1/+1 counters from Ashling the Pilgrim and deal that much damage to each creature and each player. Now you can pay 4 mana every turn to put 2+1/+1 counters on her, and that effect will trigger. And then on one turn, pay 6 mana, put 3 counters, and then you remove all of them. So that means if you had 7 counters on it and you remove 3 more, put 3 more on it, remove 10, that's 10 damage to each creature and each player. Give her lifelink, give her death touch, and that should wipe the board, if I'm not mistaken. Although protection from red still gets around it, but that's what these are for. Being able to change it to a different color, and just in general, that's a decent strategy, because red has to fight protection from red a lot. And since we're still talking about what gets lots of damage dealt, Skirk Fire Marshal from Original Onslaught block. It's a 5 mana 2/2 goblin with protection from red. Unusual, I realize. That's where this also comes into effect. You can use these to turn your opponent's creatures red until end of turn so that they don't affect Skirk Fire Marshal. The Bone Shredder is coming into play. Respond to the ability by making the Bone Shredder red. It will fizzle. That's how that works. It's yeah, that just in general, having a protection from creature in a deck where you can change the color of permanence is good. But its extra ability is you can tap 5 untapped goblins that you control, and it will deal 10 damage to each creature and each player, including itself, but the damage is negated because it's protection from red. Now, that ability, being able to throw lifelink onto it, is just... again, this deck can change the way the game is played. It just, yeah, it turns things around completely. Yeah, everything I want to say about it should be obvious at this point. I've arranged these cards to talk about them in this manner on purpose. Skirk Fire Marshal, Ashling the Pilgrim, and Molten Hydra to a lesser extent, they all work very well with this strategy. And the last one is Soul of Chandalar. Doesn't quite work as beautifully as these other cards do, but it's a very nice one because if you put lifelink on it, it has first strike, 6/6 for 6, but then you can pay 5 mana, have it deal 3 damage to target player, and 3 damage to up to 1 target creature that player controls. Up to 1 target, which means if they don't have a creature, you can still deal 3 damage to the opponent. And then you can also use its ability from the graveyard by exiling it and dealing 3 damage to target player and 3 damage to 1 target player, to target player and up to 1 creature that player controls. Where this is actually nice is you could use its ability out of the graveyard with that 5 mana. So 5 mana to deal 3 damage to your opponent and 3 damage to one of the creatures is worthwhile, even if you end up having to discard it. And that's where we get to some interesting effects, but let's stay focused on what we're doing to deal damage to everything. Pyrrhemia. Pyrrhemia is a red version of Pestilence. A very, very powerful card from, I think the Dark originally had Pestilence, although I'm not sure. Pestilence is originally 2 black and 2 enchantment, where it does the same thing as Pyrrhemia. Pyrrhemia, 2 and 2 red. At end of turn, if no creatures are in play, sacrifice Pyrrhemia. Pay 1 red mana, it deals 1 damage to each creature and each player. That includes flying creatures, I mean creatures with shadow, even creatures with protection from red if necessary. But the way this works is with Skirk Fire Marshal, Pyrrhemia never leaves play because it will never kill the last creature in play. And you kind of never want to lose Pyrrhemia. You always want to have it out, because if you have the advantage, you can press the advantage with Pyrrhemia. At the end of your opponent's turn, before your turn starts, tap out your red mana and deal enough damage to kind of whittle them down a little bit more. On your final turn, you might actually have enough mana then to just win the game because you just have the advantage in life points. Pyrrhemia is a very balancing card. It's equal for everybody, but to some players are more equal than others. That's how you press an advantage. Is you get an effect that will affect everyone equally, then you figure out how to make it better for yourself. And that's what Pyrrhemia does. That's why it's such a powerful card. So Pyrrhemia combines very well with Skirk Fire Marshal. In effect, if your opponent has a protection from red creature and you can block it with your artifacts or take away the protection from red whenever you need to, that all works because you just you just never lose Pyrrhemia, and they want to get rid of it. It's a really good card in this cycle of damage being dealt. But we have our last 2 cards. This one is probably one of my favorite, and that's Apocalypse. It helps you deal with enchantments. It's 5 mana, 3 red, 2 colorless. And it reads, remove all permanents from the game. Discard your hand. That's all permanents. Lands are removed. your opponent's lands are removed. If your opponent has no cards in hand and you end up discarding your hand, well, you're on equal footing. But if you've been keeping track of the cards that were talked about in part 1, specifically, check out that video if you can. This effect from Outpost Siege and Chandra Pyromaster are, well, yeah. The way this works, you exile the top card of your library, and because Apocalypse doesn't affect anything that's exiled, I mean, it goes ahead and removes other things from the game, you can actually use the effect to play the cards that are exiled. So you can play a land that you perhaps removed off the top of your library, or you can cast a spell with your floating mana that was removed off the top of your library. You can cast Apocalypse and leave enough mana floating to get Purphoros back out, and then cast or play a land or cast another spell with the extra mana that you've left floating. You can plan out a turn where you still get quite a bit of an advantage. In general, the reset button card, like Apocalypse, changes the game because your opponent's less prepared than you are. If I'm not mistaken, most players will play all of their lands because nobody expects a mass removal card like Armageddon, and nobody expects that kind of card from red. And while you could call this a removal card, it's not in the same vein as Armageddon or even Fisher and Ember Swallower. These cards are pinpoint land destruction, so it's not quite the same effect. You can't really look at it and say, yeah, I'm going to Apocalypse you, and then I'm going to destroy more lands. It doesn't really work that way. But being able to pull cards off the top of your library to put into play, or just to get rid of a threat, maybe hang on a couple more turns to play something that will make a difference, it's worthwhile. I mean, just getting Purphoros out helps, because then you just have to play one more creature or a land that produces tokens or any number of interesting effects, and that will work. But again, be careful when you cast this, because discarding your hand is part of the effect. You can't respond to the discard effect by putting something else into play. Everything that's going to be in play that resolves being in play will be exiled by Apocalypse. You could potentially, there's a madness creature in red where it's 5 mana for 4/4, but if you discard it, you can pay 2 and 1 red to cast it instead. That effect triggers, but does not occur before Apocalypse. Instead, it triggers after the effect of Apocalypse resolves, and then you pay 3 mana and put it into play. That's not in this deck, but I could see playing a card like that because that is a decent card. Likewise, Mogg Infestation is a removal card. It actually could work in our anti-protection from red deck, because this destroys all creatures target player controls. This includes protection from red creatures. But the reason why you'd actually not necessarily want to destroy your opponent's creatures is because you destroy all creatures target player controls, and then for each creature put into any graveyard in this the owner's graveyard, put 2 goblin tokens into play under that player's control. Treat these goblin tokens as 1/1 red creatures. So, after you destroy all of those creatures, let's say Wormcoil Engine or any number of creatures you might have in play, you then put 2 creatures in. And with Purphoros in play, because Purphoros is indestructible, essentially you're going to deal 4 damage for every creature you control. That's how that works. Mogg Infestation, target yourself, destroy all your creatures, and deal 4 damage for each of those creatures. That's should be game. If you get that combination, you get one of these, not necessarily in your opening hand, but you get this in your first 7 or 8 turns, that's your finisher. That's why the deck is the way it is. Purphoros works very well in a token deck, and perhaps it's low-hanging fruit, but I wanted to play it. It's such a fun commander. Tokens in general are great, and I love goblins. So if you're thinking about building a Purphoros deck, try building a token Purphoros deck or dash Purphoros deck or any number of effects that put more creatures into play under your control, because that's a fun deck type. It takes a lot of people off guard. So yeah. There are other cards you can put into the deck to make it interesting. You can play things like Kuldotha Phoenix. It's fairly cheap. You can pull it out of your graveyard with Metalcraft. You can go with more of an artifact strategy, Mirror Sire, and just put out tokens like Mirror Battlesphere and things like that, and build a decent deck just using artifact token abilities, and it works pretty well with that. You just never make Purphoros a creature, and you don't need to. Meanwhile, Flamewake Phoenix, that works because you can keep pulling it back into play and sacrificing it to effects or letting it die when it attacks, because Purphoros doesn't really care as long as it just keeps coming back into play. Like with Apocalypse, if you can... It doesn't quite work that way. This gets into your graveyard with Apocalypse, though. You can pull it back out of your graveyard later on. I don't play this, but again, I'm playing a lot of cards that might be a little bit out of everybody's price range, but they're still fun cards. But you don't have to play those. You can play a different type of token strategy and have a lot of fun with Purphoros in your deck. So, I hope I kind of got this across, how all the different pieces work together, how they fit, and how they intermingle, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Part 2 of tlatotem in Command, Purphoros Tokens. Hope you're having a wonderful morning, wonderful afternoon, wonderful evening, and I hope tomorrow is even better. Take care, everybody.